fire burns low tonight, its light flickering softly against the walls, and beyond the window the night lies quiet and still. Close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let yourself drift backward, far beyond the reach of memory, past centuries of kingdoms rising and falling, past the echo of swords and sermons, until you find yourself standing at the dawn of a new world. It is the year 742, and the land before you is rough and wild, a patchwork of forests and rivers, of small wooden villages scattered across the misty heart of Europe. The air smells of smoke and pine, of earth turned by the plough and warmed by the first touch of spring. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls, its sound carried over hills that have yet to know the name of empire. This is a time when the ancient world has faded, and something new is struggling to be born. A time when faith and war, learning and legend, all meet at the edge of the known world. And in this land of shifting borders and quiet power, a child has just been born. A boy who will one day be called Charles the Great, though in the simple Frankish tongue, he will be known as Karl. As the candlelight dances and your breathing slows, let the noise of the present fade. Tonight, we will walk with that boy as he becomes a king, and with that king as he becomes an emperor, a man who united a continent and shaped 1,000 years of history to come. So settle in, rest your head, the world of Charlemagne awaits. Part 1. Blood and Birthright. Imagine, if you will, a palace that is not yet grand, not marble columns and golden halls, but timber and thatch, built close to the earth. This is the court of the Franks, and it moves with the seasons from one royal estate to another, following the rhythm of harvest and hunt. The walls are thick with tapestries to keep out the cold, and the floors are strewn with rushes that whisper beneath each footfall. Here, in the year 742, perhaps in the spring, when the world was softening from winter's grip, a child was born. His name was Charles, though history would remember him by many others. Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He entered a world already shaped by the ambitions of his family, a world where his grandfather had been more than a king, and his father ruled not by ancient right, but by the sharp edge of recent triumph. Let yourself picture his father Pepin, a man of compact strength, broad-shouldered and deliberate, with a face weathered by campaigns and the weight of decision. Pepin was not born to wear a crown, but he would take one nonetheless, and the manner of that taking would echo through his son's entire life. For Pepin's father, Charles Martel, the Hammer, had been the true power behind the Frankish throne, a mayor of the palace who commanded armies and shaped kingdoms, while others wore the royal title in name only. Charles Martel had stopped the tide of Muslim expansion at the Battle of Tours in 732, a clash of faith and steel on the rolling plains of Francia. Picture that battlefield now, if you can. The autumn light slanting through broken clouds, the thunder of hooves on grass, still wet with morning dew, the glint of weapons rising and falling like waves upon a shore. Charles Martel's victory. There was more than military. It was a statement that the Frankish realm would endure, that Christian Europe had found a defender. But Charles Martel never called himself king. He ruled through others, content to wield power without the crown. When he died in 741, his legacy passed to his sons, and Pepin would not be content to remain in the shadows as his father had. The old Merovingian line, descendants of the legendary Clovis, had grown weak and hollow. Kings in title only moved from place to place like sacred relics, while others made the true decisions of state. So in the year 751, Pepin did what his father never dared. He sent envoys to Rome, to the Pope himself, and asked a simple but profound question. Who should be king, the man who holds the title, or the man who holds the power? The answer came swift and sure. With papal blessing, Pepin was anointed king of the Franks, the first of a new line. The last Merovingian king was sent quietly to a monastery, and the Carolingian dynasty was born. This was the world young Charles inherited, a world where power was justified not by ancient blood alone, but by strength, by service to the Church, by the blessing of God made visible through his representative on earth. Breathe slowly now, and let that world take shape around you. Charles grew up in the care of his mother, Bertrada, a woman of intelligence and influence, known for her diplomacy and her determination. She was called Bertha Broadfoot in legend, though whether this referred to a physical trait or was merely a poetic epithet, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that she guided her sons with a firm hand, ensuring they understood the weight of their lineage and the expectations that came with it. Charles had a brother, Charlemagne, and together they were groomed to inherit their father's realm. They learned the arts of war and governance, of law and leadership. They rode with their father's armies, watched as Pepin expanded the Frankish borders, pushing into Aquitaine, subduing rebellious nobles, establishing fortresses and alliances. The young Charles would have seen the aftermath of battle. The wounded tended by firelight, the councils held in smoky halls, the oaths sworn on relics and blades. He grew tall and strong, his frame already suggesting the powerful figure he would become. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically imposing, standing well above the average height of his time, with a thick neck, bright eyes, and a voice that could carry across a battlefield or fill a council chamber. He was active and restless, never content to remain still, always moving, hunting, riding, training. But there was more to his education than the sword. Pepin ensured his sons learned the rudiments of learning, enough Latin to follow the liturgy, enough understanding of law and custom to rule wisely. The Church was intertwined with royal authority, and a king who could not at least comprehend the words of Scripture and the forms of Christian governance would be a king diminished in the eyes of his people and of Rome. Let your mind rest for a moment on an image, a boy standing in the courtyard of a timber hall, the autumn sun low and golden, casting long shadows across the packed earth. He is perhaps 10 years old, watching as his father's warriors practice with sword and spear, their breath misting in the cool air. Somewhere inside, a scribe is copying manuscripts by candlelight, the scratch of quill on parchment barely audible. This is the world Charles knew, a world balanced between the rough realities of frontier kingship and the flickering light of learning preserved in monasteries and courts. When Pepin died in 768, that world shifted. Charles was in his mid-20s, a man tested in war and familiar with the responsibilities of leadership. According to Frankish custom, the kingdom was divided between the two brothers, Charles and Charlemagne. Charles received the outer territories, lands in the north and west, including Neustria and parts of Aquitaine. Charlemagne took the heartland, the territories closer to Austrasia and Burgundy. It was not an equal division, and it was not a peaceful one. The brothers were different in temperament and vision, and their mother Bertrada worked tirelessly to maintain peace between them, arranging marriages and alliances, mediating disputes. For 3 years, the kingdom stood divided, two brothers ruling an uneasy realm, each watching the other, each aware that a single spark could ignite conflict. Imagine those years, the tension in every council meeting, the careful weighing of words, the knowledge that every decision might bring fraternal war. The air in those halls would have been thick, not just with wood smoke and the smell of roasted meat, but with suspicion and ambition. And then, in December of 771, Charlemagne died. He was young, perhaps only 20, and the suddenness of his death left his kingdom without a clear leader. His widow and children fled to the protection of the Lombard king in Italy, fearing what Charles might do. And Charles, seeing the opportunity before him, moved decisively. He claimed Charlemagne's territories as his own, reuniting the Frankish realm under a single ruler. There were no grand battles for this inheritance, no epic sieges. It happened quietly, swiftly, the nobles and bishops of Charlemagne's lands choosing to accept Charles rather than risk civil war. And so, as the year turned and winter settled deep across the land, Charles stood alone as king of all the Franks, a ruler of a realm that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean foothills. Take a slow breath and picture him now, standing in the cold dawn of a winter morning, looking out over lands that are now his to rule, to defend, to expand. He is not yet 30 years old, but he carries the weight of his lineage, the example of his grandfather's strength and his father's ambition. The world is vast, and there are enemies on every border. But there is also possibility. There is the chance to build something greater than any Frankish king has built before. And Charles, you sense, is not a man content with what has been. He is already looking forward, already planning, already dreaming of an empire. Rest now as we leave him there in that dawn light. The story is only beginning. Part 2. The Sword and the Cross. As the seasons turn and the years unfold, let yourself drift with them, through springs when the rivers run high with snowmelt, through summers heavy with the scent of ripe grain, through autumns painted in gold and crimson, and winters when the world goes silent beneath snow. Time moves differently here, in this distant age, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the cycles of planting and harvest, by the festivals of the church, by the rhythm of war and peace. Charles did not remain still. A king in his time could not afford stillness. To rule was to be seen, to be present, to move constantly through the realm, dispensing justice, receiving oaths, showing strength. And so Charles became a figure in perpetual motion, travelling from estate to estate, his court following like a small city on the move. Wagons loaded with charters and coin, nobles on horseback, servants and scribes, guards and priests, all winding through forest paths and along Roman roads, half reclaimed by time. But more than this, Charles was a warrior. The Frankish realm was surrounded by peoples who had not bent the knee, by territories that had once been Roman and might be brought into the Christian fold, by enemies who tested the borders and threatened the stability of the kingdom. And so, year after year, when the campaign season opened in spring, Charles would gather his forces and march. Picture, if you will, the preparation for a campaign. The great estates of the kingdom are required to provide fighting men, some heavily armed, with mail shirts and iron helmets, swords and spears and shields, painted with symbols of their lords. Others come with simpler equipment, leather jerkins and wooden bucklers, axes and hunting bows. They gather in the warm months, assembling at designated points, and there is noise and dust and the smell of horses, the clang of metal being sharpened, the sound of orders shouted in Frankish and Latin, and a dozen local tongues. Charles himself is among them, tall in the saddle, his presence both reassuring and commanding. He does not lead from behind. He rides at the front, shares the hardships of the march, eats the same bread, drinks from the same streams. His men know his face, know his voice, and they follow him not just because he is their king, but because he has earned their respect on 100 fields of battle. The first great test of his reign came in the south, across the mountains where the Lombard kings ruled in Italy. The Lombards were a Germanic people who had settled in the Italian peninsula centuries before, and they had long been both allies and rivals of the Franks. But in the years after Charles took sole power, tensions grew. The Lombard king, Desiderius, had given refuge to Charlemagne's widow and sons, and he pressed his own claims against the territories of the Pope in central Italy. The Pope, Paul I, and later Stephen III, and then Hadrian, who would become one of Charles's closest allies, appealed to Charles for protection. The papacy was vulnerable, surrounded by Lombard territories, its authority challenged at every turn. And Charles, mindful of the alliance between his family and Rome, mindful of the debt he owed to the Church that had legitimized his father's kingship, made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. In the year 773, Charles gathered his forces and marched across the Alps. Imagine that journey, if you can. The Alps in autumn, when the passes are still clear, but the air is thin and cold. The narrow paths winding through rock and pine, the sound of thousands of feet and hooves echoing off stone cliffs. The baggage train stretching for miles, mules laden with supplies, wagons struggling over rough ground, and always the mountains towering above, their peaks lost in cloud, ancient and indifferent to the ambitions of kings. The Lombards had expected Charles to take the traditional route, through the pass at Monsinis. They had fortified it, prepared to hold him there in the narrow defiles. But Charles divided his forces, sending part of his army through a different pass, outflanking the defenders. It was a gamble, a risk that could have split his strength disastrously. But it worked. The Lombard defences crumbled, and Charles descended into Italy, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. He moved swiftly down the Po Valley, the rich heartland of the Lombard kingdom. Desiderius withdrew to Pavia, his capital, and prepared for a siege. And Charles, patient and methodical, settled in for the long wait. Picture, if you will, the camp outside Pavia. It is not a temporary affair of tents and campfires, but a semi-permanent settlement with wooden palisades and ditches, storehouses and forges, even a chapel where mass is said each morning. The siege drags on through winter and into spring, and Charles does not waste the time. He travels, leaving trusted commanders to maintain the siege, and makes his way to Rome. It is Easter of 774 when Charles enters the Eternal City. Imagine the scene. The great basilicas rising against the sky, their walls ancient and weathered, still bearing the faint marks of imperial grandeur. The streets are narrow and winding, lined with buildings both grand and humble, and everywhere there are churches, monasteries, shrines to martyrs, whose names echo back to the age of persecution. Pope Hadrian receives Charles with all the ceremony due to a protector and ally. They meet at St. Peter's, and there, in the flickering light of candles and beneath the solemn gaze of mosaics depicting saints and apostles, Charles confirms the promises his father had made. He pledges to defend the Church, to uphold the territories granted to the Pope, to be a champion of Christendom. And Hadrian, in turn, recognizes Charles as the rightful king of the Franks and Lombards, a defender of the faith, a man chosen by God to protect his Church. It is a partnership, a bond that will endure for decades. A partnership between spiritual and temporal power, between the authority of Rome and the strength of the Frankish throne. Breathe slowly now, and let that moment settle. It is not just a political alliance. It is the foundation of something larger, something that will reshape Europe. Charles has stepped into a role that no Frankish king has fully occupied before. Not just a war leader or tribal chief, but a Christian king in the Roman tradition, a ruler whose legitimacy comes as much from his service to the Church as from his prowess in battle. After Easter, Charles returns to Pavia. The siege has held, and the city is starving. In June, Desiderius surrenders. Charles takes the Iron Crown of Lombardy, adding it to his Frankish title, and the Lombard kingdom ceases to exist as an independent realm. Desiderius is sent to a monastery, his power ended not by execution, but by exile into holy orders. Italy is now part of Charles's realm, and the Pope is secure under Frankish protection. But this is only the beginning. The map of Europe is vast, and there are other peoples, other kingdoms, other borders to be tested and crossed. For the next 3 decades, Charles will be at war more often than not. Not continuous war, but a pattern of campaigns, each spring a new army, each autumn a return with victory, or the need to return again the next year. Let yourself feel the rhythm of it, the way war becomes not an interruption, but a constant aspect of governance, as routine as the harvest or the collection of taxes. To the north and east across the Rhine lay the Saxons, a fierce and independent people, pagan still, worshipping the old gods of forest and thunder. They raided into Frankish territory, burning churches and villages, taking captives and plunder. For Charles, they were both a threat and a challenge, a reminder that his realm was not yet secure, that there were lands just beyond his borders where Christian authority did not reach. In 772, even before the Italian campaign, Charles had led an army into Saxony and destroyed the Irminsul, a sacred tree or pillar that was central to Saxon pagan worship. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that the old gods were powerless before the God of the Christians. But the Saxons did not submit. They retreated into their forests, regrouped, and when Charles was occupied elsewhere, they struck back. And so began a long, bitter struggle that would last more than 30 years. Imagine the landscape of Saxony, dense forests of oak and beech, rivers winding through marshland, hills rising from mist-shrouded valleys. It is terrain that favors the defender, that swallows armies and hides raiders. The Saxons knew every path, every ford, every hiding place. They fought not in set battles, but in ambushes and skirmishes, appearing suddenly to strike, and then melting away before a counterattack could be organized. Charles responded with a strategy of conquest and conversion. He built fortresses at key points, garrisoned them with Frankish troops, and required the Saxon nobles to send hostages to his court as guarantees of peace. He brought missionaries and priests, men like Sturm and Willehad, who preached the gospel and built churches in newly pacified regions. And he imposed harsh laws. Any Saxon who refused baptism or who reverted to pagan practices faced death or enslavement. It was a brutal policy, born of the harsh realities of the time. Charles believed, as did most of his contemporaries, that the unity of the realm depended on religious unity, that a pagan population could never be truly loyal to a Christian king. And so the sword and the cross advanced together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tragic contradiction. Picture a scene from this long war. It is summer, and a Frankish army is marching through a forest path. The trees press close on either side, their leaves a canopy that filters the sunlight into green and gold. The soldiers are tense, eyes scanning the shadows, hands ready on their weapons. Somewhere ahead, a scout raises a hand, and the column halts. There is a sound, or perhaps the absence of sound, the too sudden silence of birds that should be singing. And then the attack comes, arrows whistling from the trees, warriors rushing from concealment with axes and spears. The Franks form a shield wall, weathering the assault, and their own archers return fire. It is over quickly, the Saxons withdrawing as suddenly as they appeared, leaving the Franks to count their dead and wounded and continue the march. Such skirmishes happen dozens, perhaps hundreds of times over the years, and each time Charles responded not with retreat, but with escalation. He settled Frankish families in Saxon territory, establishing colonies that would hold the land, even when the armies withdrew. He held assemblies where Saxon leaders were required to appear and swear oaths of loyalty, and those who refused were exiled or executed. In 782, after a particularly devastating Saxon uprising, Charles ordered the execution of over 4,000 Saxon prisoners at Verdun. It was an act that shocked even his own time, and it remains one of the darkest episodes of his reign. The exact circumstances are debated, whether it was a mass execution or a conflation of casualties from battle, but the memory of it speaks to the ruthlessness with which Charles pursued his goals. Yet he was also capable of mercy and pragmatism. When the Saxon leader Widukind finally submitted in 785, accepting baptism with Charles himself standing as his godfather, Charles did not execute him, but welcomed him as a Christian lord, granting him lands and authority within the Frankish system. It was a calculated gesture, meant to show that submission brought reward, that the Frankish realm could absorb even its most stubborn enemies. Breathe deeply, and let the weight of these years settle. And faith, conquest and conversion, all tangled together in ways that are hard for us to untangle now. Charles was not a simple figure. He was devout, genuinely so, and believed that the expansion of his realm was the expansion of Christendom, a work pleasing to God. But he was also ruthless, willing to use terror and force when persuasion failed. The conquest of Saxony was not the only front. To the south, in Spain, Muslim emirs ruled the lands that had once been Visigothic kingdoms. In 778, Charles led an expedition across the Pyrenees, responding to an appeal from a Muslim faction that sought his help against rivals. It was an unusual alliance, Christian and Muslim united by temporary political convenience, and it ended in frustration. The expedition achieved little, and on the return journey, as the Frankish army crossed back through the mountain passes, disaster struck. The rearguard of the army, commanded by Roland, a trusted paladin of Charles, was ambushed by Basque mountain warriors at a narrow pass called Roncevaux. Picture that scene now. The long column of men and wagons strung out along a mountain road, the peaks towering on either side, the sky hard and blue. And then the sudden attack, rocks and spears raining down from the heights. The rearguard caught in a trap, from which there was no escape. Roland and his companions fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed. By the time the main army could respond, the rearguard was destroyed, and Roland was dead. Charles mourned the loss deeply, and though the disaster at Roncevaux was a small episode in military terms, it would live on in memory and legend. Centuries later, poets would transform it into the Song of Roland, an epic of loyalty and heroism, casting the Basques as Saracen warriors and Roland as the perfect Christian knight. But in the moment, it was simply a painful reminder that even a great king could not control everything, that the mountains held their own dangers beyond the reach of royal power. Yet Charles did not abandon his interest in the Spanish frontier. Over the following years, he established the Spanish March, a buffer zone of fortified territories along the Pyrenees, governed by loyal counts who held the line against Muslim incursions. It was a defensive strategy, creating a stable border rather than attempting outright conquest, and it proved effective for generations. Let your mind wander now across the breadth of Charles's realm. By the year 785, he rules a kingdom that stretches from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. He has conquered the Lombards, subjected the Saxons, established marches along the borders with the Slavs and the Muslims. His court is constantly on the move, travelling from one royal estate to another, from Herstal to Ingelheim, from Thionville to Nijmegen, and increasingly to Aachen, a place he is beginning to favour for its hot springs and central location. Imagine arriving at one of these royal estates in the early evening, as the sun sets behind the trees and the first stars appear. The estate is a complex of buildings, a great hall with a high roof and smoke drifting from the central hearth, smaller buildings for storage and lodging, a chapel where candles are being lit for evening prayers, stables and workshops humming with activity. There are perhaps hundreds of people here, from nobles and their retinues to servants and craftsmen, all drawn by the presence of the king. Inside the great hall, the air is warm and close, scented with wood smoke and roasting meat. Trestle tables are being set, and men and women find their places according to rank and custom. Charles sits at the high table, his presence commanding even in repose. He is in his 40s now, his beard streaked with grey, his frame still powerful, but bearing the marks of countless campaigns, scars from battle, the stiffness that comes from years in the saddle. He does not eat alone. Around him are the great men of his realm, his counts and dukes, his advisers and kinsmen, the bishops and abbots who serve both spiritual and temporal roles in his government. They speak of matters of state, of harvests and taxes, of disputes that need settling, of threats on the borders. And Charles listens, asks questions, makes decisions with the same decisive energy he brings to the battlefield. There are also moments of relaxation. Charles enjoys hunting, and the forests around his estates are rich with game, deer and boar, wolves and bears. He rides out with his nobles and sons, the hounds running ahead, the thrill of the chase, a brief respite from the burdens of rule. And in the evenings, there is music, the sound of a lyre or a voice raised in song, tales of heroes and battles, psalms and hymns, that fill the hall with something approaching beauty. Rest now, and let these images settle. The world of Charlemagne is vast and complex, full of movement and noise and life. But beneath it all is a pattern, a purpose, a vision slowly taking shape. Charles is building something more than a kingdom. He's building an empire. And as the years pass, that vision will become clearer, grander, more enduring than even he might have imagined. Part 3. The Builder of Empire. As the decades turn and the realm expands, Charles begins to understand that conquest alone is not enough. To rule an empire is to shape it, to give it structure and law, to bind its diverse peoples together, not just by the threat of force, but by shared institutions and common purpose. And so, alongside the ceaseless campaigns, Charles becomes a builder of administration, of law, of culture itself. Let yourself drift now into this quieter, but no less important aspect of his reign. Imagine the year is around 790, and Charles is in his late 40s. The great conquests are largely accomplished, though the Saxon wars will continue for another decade. The realm is stable, prosperous even, and Charles can turn his attention to the work of governance. He sits in council, surrounded by advisers and documents, parchment scrolls covered in careful Latin script. These are the capitularies, the royal decrees that will govern every aspect of life in the empire, from the administration of justice to the conduct of monks, from the maintenance of roads and bridges to the education of the clergy. Charles issues them regularly, dozens over the years, each one addressing some aspect of the realm's functioning. Picture the process. A problem is identified. Perhaps tax revenues are not being collected properly, or judges are corrupt, or monasteries are not maintaining their lands as they should. The issue is brought to the king, and he consults with his advisers, men like Alcuin of York, who has become one of his closest confidants. They debate, they consider precedents, they draft a decree, and then it is sent out, carried by royal messengers, to every corner of the realm, to be read aloud in assemblies and enforced by the king's representatives. These representatives are called missi dominici, the king's envoys, and they are a crucial innovation. Charles cannot be everywhere at once, and the empire is too large for any single man to govern directly. So he sends out pairs of men, usually a count and a bishop, secular and spiritual authority together, to travel through designated regions, hearing cases, inspecting local administration, ensuring that royal commands are being obeyed, and that justice is being done. Imagine them on the road, 2 men on horseback, followed by a small retinue, traveling through countryside where the king's authority is more an idea than a presence. They arrive at a local estate, and the people gather, nobles and freemen, peasants who have grievances, clergy with concerns about their parishes. The misty hear them all, dispensing justice according to the law, investigating corruption, recording oaths. And then they move on, carrying the king's will into every corner of the realm. It is an imperfect system, certainly. Distance and communication delays mean that local lords retain significant autonomy, and not every decree is enforced with equal rigor. But it establishes a principle, a sense that the king's justice reaches everywhere, that there is a standard of law that applies across the entire empire. Charles is also deeply concerned with law itself. The Frankish legal tradition is ancient, rooted in customary practice, passed down orally through generations. But Charles seeks to codify it, to write it down so that it can be applied consistently. He commissions the compilation of law codes for the different peoples within his realm. Frankish law, Saxon law, Lombard law, each preserved in its particularity, but all subject to the overarching authority of the king. Picture a scriptorium, a room in a monastery where monks labor over manuscripts. The light is dim, coming from narrow windows and the flicker of candles. A monk sits hunched over parchment, his quill moving slowly and carefully, copying out the text of a law code. Each letter is formed with precision, and the work is painstaking. A single page might take hours, a full manuscript months or years. But this is how knowledge is preserved, how law is made permanent. Charles also reforms the coinage. In a time when much trade is still conducted through barter, when coins are often debased or inconsistent, he introduces a new standard, the silver penny, carefully regulated in weight and purity. It bears his name and title, and it becomes the common currency across the empire, facilitating trade and establishing a unified economic system. Merchants can travel from the Rhineland to Italy, from Aquitaine to Bavaria, and know that the coins they carry will be accepted, that they are backed by the authority of the king. But perhaps the most enduring of Charles's reforms is in the realm of learning and culture. This is the aspect of his reign that later ages would call the Carolingian Renaissance, though in his own time it was simply an effort to raise the level of education among the clergy and to preserve the knowledge of the past. Charles himself was not a scholar. He had learned to read, though his Latin was functional rather than elegant, and he reportedly tried to learn to write, keeping tablets by his bed to practice forming letters. But writing was a skill learned in youth, and Charles had been trained as a warrior. Still, he recognized the importance of learning, understood that a king needed educated advisers, that the church needed literate priests who could read scripture and celebrate Mass properly. And so he brought scholars to his court from across Christendom. The greatest of these was Alcuin, a monk from York, learned in the traditions of Anglo-Saxon England, a man who had studied under the finest teachers of his generation. Charles invited Alcuin to join his court in the early 780s, and Alcuin became not just a teacher, but a friend, a correspondent, a voice of wisdom and learning in the often rough world of the Frankish court. Picture Alcuin, an older man with a keen mind and a gentle manner, sitting with Charles in the evening after the day's business is done. They discuss theology, philosophy, the interpretation of scripture. Charles asks questions, probes, challenges. He is not content with easy answers, and he values Alcuin's ability to explain complex ideas in terms he can grasp. Together, they plan reforms, establishing schools, improving the quality of manuscripts, encouraging the study of the liberal arts. Alcuin becomes the head of the palace school, educating the sons of nobles and Charles's own children. It is not a formal institution like a modern university, but a gathering of bright minds, a place where learning is valued and encouraged. The curriculum includes grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the classical liberal arts that had been preserved, however imperfectly, through the centuries since Rome's fall. Monks and scribes across the empire are encouraged to copy manuscripts, preserving not just religious texts, but also works of classical literature, history, and philosophy. Many of the ancient texts that survive to our own time do so, because they were copied in Carolingian scriptoria. Without this effort, we might have lost Virgil, Cicero, Tacitus. The voices of the ancient world might have faded entirely into silence. Let yourself imagine a monastery library now. Shelves lined with manuscripts, bound in leather and wood, each one a repository of knowledge. The smell of parchment and ink, the quiet rustle of pages being turned. A monk reads by candlelight, his lips moving silently as he absorbs the words of Augustine or Jerome, the wisdom of the Church Fathers mingling with the echoes of pagan Rome. Charles also reforms the liturgy, the forms of Christian worship used throughout his realm. There were regional variations, different practices in different areas, and Charles sought to standardize them, bringing the Frankish Church into closer alignment with Rome. The Roman liturgy was adopted. A new chant melodies were introduced, what would later be called Gregorian chant. Though much of its development happened in Frankish lands under Charles's patronage. Imagine the sound of that chant now, voices rising in unison, the Latin words echoing off stone walls, the melody simple but profound, designed to lift the soul toward the divine. This music fills the churches Charles builds, the monasteries he endows, the chapels where he himself prays each morning and evening. For Charles is devout, genuinely and deeply. He attends Mass regularly, observes the fasts and feasts of the church calendar, endows monasteries and churches with generous grants of land. He sees his role as king, not just as a secular duty, but as a sacred trust, a responsibility to govern in a way that pleases God and leads his people towards salvation. In this, he is influenced by the model of the Old Testament kings, David and Solomon, rulers chosen by God to lead his people. Charles sees himself in that tradition, a Christian king whose authority comes from divine will. And the Church, for its part, reinforces this vision, celebrating Charles in sermons and letters as a new David, a defender of the faith, a light in the darkness of the world. Breathe slowly now, and feel the weight of that responsibility. To be a king, in Charles's understanding, is not simply to wield power, but to answer for how that power is used. It is to ensure justice, to protect the weak, to uphold the church, to be an example of Christian virtue, even in a world where violence and power often seem to rule. And nowhere does this vision become more tangible than in the place Charles chooses as the center of his realm, the palace at Aachen. Picture it now, as it rises from the landscape in the late 780s and through the 790s. Aachen is not a city in the Roman sense, but a royal estate that Charles transforms into something approaching a capital. He is drawn to the place for practical reasons. It sits at a crossroads of the realm, accessible from all directions, and it has natural hot springs where he can ease the aches of a body worn by decades of warfare. But more than this, Aachen becomes a statement, a physical embodiment of Charles's vision for his empire. The palace complex is built in stone, a rare luxury in a world where most buildings are timber. There is a great hall for feasts and assemblies, administrative buildings for the machinery of government, living quarters for the royal family and courtiers. And at the heart of it all, Charles builds a chapel. Not a simple wooden church, but a soaring architectural achievement, modeled after the great churches of Rome and Ravenna. The Palatine Chapel, as it comes to be called, is octagonal in shape, its interior rising in tiers to a dome high above. The walls are decorated with marble and mosaics, the light filtering through windows of colored glass. There are columns brought from Italy, salvaged from ancient Roman buildings, connecting Charles's empire to the grandeur of the classical past. And there, in the gallery above the main floor, is a throne where Charles sits during services, positioned so that he is between the congregation below and the altar before him, a visible symbol of his role as mediator between the earthly and the divine. Let yourself stand there for a moment in that chapel, as the morning light streams through the windows and the voices of the choir rise in chant. The air is cool and slightly damp, scented with incense. Charles is present, a massive figure dressed in Frankish tunic and cloak. He never adopted Roman-style robes, preferring the traditional dress of his people, but there is nothing simple about his bearing. He stands as a king, a protector of Christendom, a ruler whose authority is validated by God himself. Aachen becomes more than a residence. It becomes a symbol, a place where scholars and nobles, bishops and craftsmen gather from across the empire and beyond. Envoys arrive from Byzantium, from Muslim Spain, from the kingdoms of the north, bringing gifts and treaties, seeking alliances and trade agreements. The court at Aachen is cosmopolitan in a way that few places in Western Europe can match, a crossroads where different cultures and traditions meet and mingle. Charles's family, too, gathers at Aachen. He is married multiple times. The exact number of wives and concubines is a matter of some historical debate, and he has fathered many children. He is devoted to them, ensuring that his sons are trained in the arts of war and governance, that his daughters are educated in letters and music. Unlike many rulers of his time, Charles keeps his daughters close, unmarried, perhaps unwilling to see them leave his court, or to risk the political complications that marriage alliances might bring. Picture an evening in the palace, the great hall filled with family and courtiers. Charles sits at the center, his sons and daughters around him. There is laughter, conversation, the hum of a community bound by blood and loyalty. Charles's eldest son, also named Charles, is being groomed to inherit the Frankish heartland. Another son, Pepin, is designated as King of Italy, ruling from Pavia under his father's oversight. A third son, Louis, will govern Aquitaine, learning kingship in a region that still remembers its independence and must be ruled with a careful hand. But there is also sorrow woven through these years. Charles's wife Hildegard, who bore him many children and whom he seems to have loved deeply, dies young in 783. He mourns her, and though he marries again, none of his subsequent marriages have the same emotional resonance. And his eldest son, Charles the Younger, so carefully trained and prepared, will die in 811, before his father, leaving the question of succession suddenly uncertain. But those sorrows lie in the future. For now, in these years around 790, the empire is at its height, stable and prosperous. The wars in Saxony are winding down, the borders are secure, and Charles has time to focus on the work of governance and culture. Let yourself drift now across the empire and see it as it might have appeared in these years. From the windswept coasts of Brittany to the Alps, from the Rhine to the Danube, it is a patchwork of landscapes and peoples. There are great forests where wolves and bears still roam, rivers that serve as highways for trade and communication, monasteries perched on hilltops, villages clustered around churches, market towns where merchants from distant lands meet to exchange goods. The population is small by modern standards, perhaps 15 or 20 million people in the entire empire, and life is hard for most. Peasants work the land from dawn to dusk, their lives bound by the seasons and by obligations to their lords. Famine and disease are constant threats, and the average lifespan is short. But there is also resilience, community, a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. The church is present everywhere, its buildings and clergy a constant presence in daily life. Monks and nuns pray the hours, their voices marking the passage of time. Priests celebrate Mass, hear confessions, offer what comfort they can in a world that often seems harsh and unforgiving. And everywhere, the authority of King Charles is acknowledged. his name invoked in prayers and legal documents, his laws enforced by counts and bishops who govern in his name. It is not paradise, this empire. There is injustice, cruelty, inequality. Slavery still exists, though the church discourages the enslavement of Christians. Women have few legal rights, their lives largely determined by fathers and husbands. Warfare, though less frequent than in earlier generations, still claims lives and devastates regions. But there is also order, a sense that the chaos of the early Middle Ages is being tamed, that civilization is taking root again in the ruins of Rome. And at the center of it all is Charles, a figure of immense energy and will. Even as he ages, he does not slow down. He continues to travel, to hunt, to preside over assemblies, to issue decrees. He corresponds with scholars and popes, with kings and emirs. He is a force of nature, larger than life, and his presence shapes everything around him. Rest now, and let these images settle. The empire is built, and it endures. But the question that begins to occupy Charles's mind, and the minds of his advisers, is what comes next. What is the nature of this realm he has created? Is it simply a Frankish kingdom grown large, or is it something more? Is there a way to give it a name, a legitimacy, a place in the grand sweep of history? The answer to that question will come unexpectedly on a winter day in Rome at the turn of a new century. Part 4. The Crown of Empire. The year is 799, and far from the palace at Aachen, in the ancient streets of Rome, violence erupts. Pope Leo III, who has succeeded Hadrian on the papal throne, is attacked by rivals, members of the Roman nobility who accuse him of various crimes and seek to depose him. They assault him in the street, attempting to blind him and cut out his tongue, the traditional punishments for perjury and false testimony. Leo survives, though wounded, and flees north, seeking the protection of the one man with the power to restore him, King Charles. Imagine the Pope's arrival at Paderborn, where Charles is holding court in the summer of 799. Leo is travel-worn, still bearing the marks of his ordeal, a figure of spiritual authority brought low by worldly violence. Charles receives him with honor, listens to his account, and promises to investigate the charges against him. It is a delicate situation, fraught with political and theological implications. Can a king judge a pope? Can temporal authority stand in judgment over spiritual? Charles proceeds carefully, convening an assembly of bishops and nobles to hear the case. In the end, Leo is given the opportunity to purge himself of the accusations through an oath, swearing before God and man that he is innocent. No one dares to challenge him, and Charles declares the matter settled. Leo is restored to the papal throne, and Charles agrees to travel to Rome to formalize the resolution. So it is that Charles finds himself in Rome in the winter of 800, celebrating Christmas in the Eternal City. Picture the scene on the night of December 24th. The streets of Rome cold and quiet, the ancient buildings rising like ghosts of empire past. Charles attends Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, the greatest church in Christendom, its interior vast and dimly lit, filled with the faithful who have gathered for the celebration of Christ's birth. Charles is at prayer, kneeling before the altar, his mind perhaps on spiritual matters, perhaps on the complex political situation he has just navigated. The Mass proceeds with its ancient rhythms, the Latin words echoing off stone walls that have witnessed 1,500 years of Christian worship. And then, as Charles rises from prayer, Pope Leo approaches. In his hands is a crown, golden and glittering in the candlelight. And before Charles can react, before the full assembly, Leo places the crown upon Charles's head and proclaims him Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. The crowd erupts in acclamation. their voices filling the basilica. To Charles, most pious Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor, life and victory. The formula is ancient, the same that greeted Roman emperors centuries before. And in that moment, with that crown and that acclamation, the Frankish king becomes something more. A successor to Caesar and Constantine, a Christian emperor in the West. Let that moment settle and feel its weight. Charles, according to his biographer Einhard, claimed afterward that he was surprised, that if he had known what Leo intended, he would not have entered the church that day. But whether this is true, or merely political discretion, we cannot say. Certainly Charles benefited from the coronation, and he made no move to refuse the title or return the crown. What the coronation represented was a bold claim that the imperial dignity, which had lapsed in the West with the fall of Rome centuries before, could be revived, that a Christian king ruling from beyond the Alps could legitimately claim the mantle of the Caesars. It was an assertion of independence from Byzantium, where emperors still ruled in Constantinople and considered themselves the sole legitimate heirs of Rome. And it was a statement about the relationship between church and state, the Pope conferring legitimacy upon the emperor, yet the emperor providing protection to the Pope. Picture Charles now, as he leaves Rome and returns north to Aachen, wearing not just the crown of the Franks and Lombards, but the imperial diadem, his title expanded, his authority redefined. He is no longer simply a tribal king, or even a successful conqueror. He is an emperor, a title that carries with it echoes of Rome's glory and the weight of governing an entire civilization. But Charles is too practical, too experienced, to let the title go to his head. He knows that empires are not maintained by crowns and ceremonies, but by the daily work of governance, by justice enforced and borders defended. And so he returns to that work, the same work he has been doing for decades, but now with an added sense of historical mission. The Byzantine Empire, ruling from Constantinople, does not initially recognize the coronation. To the Byzantines, there can be only one emperor of the Romans, and that is the emperor in the East. Charles's assumption of the title is seen as presumptuous, even heretical, but Charles is patient. He continues to rule effectively, to maintain order in the West, and gradually, through diplomacy and demonstrations of power, he wins a grudging acceptance. In 812, the Byzantine Emperor Michael finally recognizes Charles's imperial title, though carefully avoiding the phrase Emperor of the Romans in favor of alternatives that preserve Byzantine sensibilities. But if the Byzantines are skeptical, Charles's own subjects embrace the new dignity. Well, it gives a name and a shape to what they have been building, a sense that they are part of something grander than a tribal kingdom. Coins minted in Charles's name now bear the imperial title. Documents and charters refer to him as emperor. And in the palace at Aachen, Charles rules as a Christian emperor, continuing the reforms and policies that have defined his reign. Let yourself imagine him now in these final years of his life, an old man by the standards of his time, but still vigorous, still engaged. He is in his 60s, his beard long and white, his frame still large, though perhaps bowed slightly by the years. He rises early, attends Mass, receives petitions, consults with advisers, dictates letters to far-flung correspondents. He is concerned with succession, with ensuring that the empire he has built will endure after his death. He has lost sons, the most painful being the death of Charles the Younger in 811, and of Pepin, king of Italy, in 810. By 813, only one legitimate son remains, Louis, called the Pious, who governs Aquitaine. Charles summons him to Aachen, and, in a ceremony carefully designed to emphasize continuity and legitimacy, crowns him as co-emperor. It is a passing of the torch, a way of ensuring that the transition will be smooth. Breathe slowly and feel the passage of time. The years have been long, full of accomplishment and loss, triumph and tragedy. Charles has seen his realm expand from a Frankish kingdom to an empire that encompasses most of Western and Central Europe. He has seen barbarian tribes converted to Christianity, ancient laws codified, schools established, churches built. He has been a warrior and a judge, a patron of learning and a defender of the faith. But he is also aware of his mortality. His health begins to decline. He suffers from fevers and pain in his side, the lingering effects of old wounds and decades of hard campaigning. In January of 814, as winter grips Aachen, he falls seriously ill. He takes to his bed, and those around him know that the end is near. Picture that final scene, if you can. The chamber is dim, lit by candles that flicker in draughts from the shuttered windows. Charles lies in bed, surrounded by his family, by bishops who have come to offer final prayers, by nobles who have served him for decades. The air is heavy with the scent of herbs and incense, and outside the world waits in anxious silence. Charles receives the last sacraments, confesses his sins, makes provision for his soul and for the distribution of his treasures. Vast amounts of gold and silver accumulated over a lifetime, which he directs should go to the church, to the poor, to his heirs. He speaks little conserving his strength, but those present report that he is calm, accepting of what is to come, confident that he has done his duty before God and man. On January 28th, 814, at 9 in the morning, Charles breathes his last. The great king, the builder of empire, the defender of Christendom, passes from this world into the next. Let that moment settle and feel the silence that follows. The news spreads slowly, carried by messengers on horseback, through winter roads, from Aachen to the farthest reaches of the empire. In churches and monasteries, prayers are offered for his soul. In the great hall at Aachen, nobles gather to mourn and to swear allegiance to his successor. And in the Palatine chapel, Charles is laid to rest, his body placed in a tomb beneath the stones where he so often prayed. He is gone, but what he built remains, an empire that, though it will eventually fragment, establishes patterns of governance, culture, and identity that will shape Europe for centuries. The schools he founded continue to educate, the laws he codified continue to guide, the churches he built continue to shelter the faithful, and the memory of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, becomes a touchstone for kings and emperors who come after, a model of Christian kingship, a symbol of a time when Europe seemed, for a moment, to be united under a single vision. Rest now, as we leave that tomb in Aachen. The story of his life is told, but the legacy continues. Let yourself breathe deeply and prepare to hear how that legacy unfolds. Part 5. The Legacy and the Memory. In the years after Charles's death, the empire he built begins to shift and change, like a great structure settling onto its foundations. His son Louis the Pious inherits the imperial title and the vast territories, and he rules with piety and determination. But he does not have his father's iron will or his gift for inspiring absolute loyalty. The empire holds together during Louis's lifetime, but already there are strains, rivalries between his sons, regional identities asserting themselves. The sheer difficulty of governing such a vast and diverse realm with the limited tools of communication and control available in the 9th century. Let yourself drift forward now through the decades that follow Charles's death. Picture the landscape changing slowly, borders shifting, kingdoms emerging and dissolving, the great unity of Charles's empire fragmenting into smaller realms. In 843, Louis's sons divide the empire among themselves in the Treaty of Verdun, creating 3 kingdoms that will eventually evolve into France, Germany, and a middle kingdom that includes parts of Italy and the Low Countries. It is a fracturing, but not a collapse. The memory of Charlemagne remains powerful, and each of these successor kingdoms claims to be the true heir of his legacy. Kings and emperors invoke his name, pattern their governance on his example, even claim to possess his relics, his sword, his crown, fragments of bone said to be his. The coronation ritual he experienced in Rome becomes a template, and for centuries afterward, Holy Roman emperors travel to Rome to receive their crown from the Pope, reenacting that moment on Christmas Day, 800. Imagine the memory of Charlemagne taking on a life of its own, becoming larger than the historical man. In monasteries, scribes write chronicles and biographies, shaping his image for posterity. The most influential is written by Einhard, a scholar who knew Charles personally and wrote a life of Charlemagne modelled on the biographies of Roman emperors. Einhard presents Charles as the ideal Christian ruler, strong but just, devout but practical, learned but humble. It is a carefully crafted portrait, emphasizing virtues and downplaying flaws, and it becomes the foundation for how later generations understand Charlemagne. But the memory goes beyond historical texts. Charles becomes a figure of legend, appearing in epic poems and romances. The Song of Roland, composed centuries after the actual events, transforms the disaster at Roncesvalles into an epic of Christian heroism, with Roland as the perfect knight and Charles as the wise and sorrowful king who avenges his death. In this version, the Basque ambushers become Muslim warriors, and the story becomes one of religious conflict rather than regional politics, a reflection of the crusading era in which the poem was written, but one that deeply influenced how people imagined Charlemagne. Let yourself hear that poem now, recited in a great hall by a wandering jongleur, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the verse, the audience leaning forward to catch every word. Roland sounds his horn, Durandal his sword flashes in the mountain pass, and Charles rides too late to save him, but in time to exact terrible vengeance. It is not history, not in the way we understand it, but it is memory transformed into meaning, into a story that speaks to the values and concerns of the people who tell it. In Germany, Charlemagne is remembered as Karl der Große, the founder of German imperial tradition, the king who brought Christianity to the Saxons and established the foundations of the Holy Roman Empire. In France, he is Charlemagne, the first great king of the Franks, a symbol of French glory and the sacred bond between crown and altar. Each nation claims him, shapes his memory to fit its own narrative, and in doing so keeps his name alive across the centuries. Breathe slowly and let the centuries drift by. The Middle Ages unfold, and Charlemagne remains a constant presence. Medieval kings model themselves on him, seeking to recreate his empire, or at least to claim his legacy. Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century, Frederick II in the 13th, Charles V in the 16th, all invoke Charlemagne's name, all seek to be seen as his successors. The title, Holy Roman Emperor, endures until the 19th century, a direct link to that moment in St. Peter's Basilica, when Leo placed the crown on Charles's head. The Church, too, remembers Charlemagne. He is never officially canonized. The process of formal canonization does not fully develop until after his time, but he is venerated as a saint in some regions, particularly in Aachen, where his tomb becomes a pilgrimage site. Later medieval popes, seeking to strengthen their own authority, point to Charlemagne as an example of the ideal relationship between secular and spiritual power. A king who served the church and was rewarded with the imperial crown. Picture pilgrims arriving in Aachen, century after century, coming to pray at the tomb of the great emperor. The Palatine Chapel still stands, its architecture a testament to Charles's vision. The pilgrims kneel on the stones where Charles once knelt, touch the walls he commissioned, and carry away memories and prayers, spreading his fame across Christendom. The Renaissance brings a renewed interest in classical learning, and scholars rediscover the Carolingian Renaissance that Charles sponsored. They marvel at the manuscripts copied in Carolingian scriptoria, at the preservation of classical texts that might otherwise have been lost. Humanists praise Charlemagne as a patron of learning, a king who understood that culture and education are as important as military might. The Carolingian script developed in his scriptoria becomes the basis for the typefaces used in early printed books, and thus influences the very shape of the letters you are reading now. Let yourself feel the long arc of this influence. Charlemagne's reforms in education, his support for monastic learning, his establishment of schools, these ripple forward through time. The universities that rise in the 12th and 13th centuries build on foundations laid in Charles's era. The ideal of the learned Christian king, the ruler who is both warrior and scholar, patron of arts and defender of faith, this ideal shapes European kingship for 1,000 years. But the legacy is not just institutional or political. It is also about identity, about the very idea of Europe. Charlemagne's empire, though it fragmented, established a sense that Western and Central Europe could be unified, that diverse peoples could share a common culture, a common faith, a common set of values. When later generations speak of Christendom or the West, they are invoking, consciously or not, the vision that Charlemagne pursued, a civilization defined not by ethnic or linguistic unity, but by shared religion, shared laws, shared institutions. In the 20th century, as Europe sought to rebuild after the devastation of 2 world wars, Charlemagne became a symbol of European unity once again. The city of Aachen established the Charlemagne Prize, awarded annually to figures who contribute to European integration. Political leaders invoked his name when discussing the European coal and steel community, the precursor to the European Union. The idea was explicit, that Europe could find unity again, as it had under Charlemagne, not through conquest, but through cooperation and shared purpose. Picture a ceremony in Aachen, in some year of the late 20th or early 21st century, where a European leader accepts the Charlemagne Prize. The Palatine Chapel looms nearby, its stones weathered by 12 centuries of wind and rain, but still standing. The speaker talks of unity, of shared values of the European project, and behind those words is the long shadow of the man buried beneath those stones, the emperor who dreamed of a united Christendom and made it, for a time, a reality. Breathe deeply now, and let yourself return to the present moment, to the quiet room where you began this journey. The fire has burned down to embers, the night is deep and still, and the story of Charlemagne has carried you across more than 1,000 years. What can we say, finally, about this man and his legacy? He was not perfect. No human is. His wars were brutal, his methods sometimes cruel, his vision limited by the assumptions of his time. He could not have imagined the Europe that exists today, with its nation-states and democracies, its secular governments and pluralistic societies. And yet, his influence is undeniable. He established patterns of governance that endured. He showed that a Christian king could be both warrior and scholar, that power could be exercised in service of higher ideals. He preserved knowledge that might have been lost, built institutions that shaped generations. He gave Europe a memory of unity, an idea that diverse peoples could be bound together by something larger than tribe or territory. And beyond the political and cultural legacy, there is something more intimate, more human. Charlemagne was a man who lived fully in his time, who rode into battle and knelt in prayer, who laughed with his children and mourned his losses, who aged and sickened and died, like all of us must. He was ambitious and capable, devout and practical, a figure of immense energy and will. And in his striving, in his successes and failures, he reminds us that history is made by human beings, by men and women who make choices, who act on their beliefs, who shape the world they inhabit. So let his story be a comfort, as you drift towards sleep. Let it remind you that the world we inherit was shaped by those who came before, that their struggles and triumphs echo forward through time, that we are all part of a long story that stretches back into the mists of the past and forward into an unknowable future. Rest now. Close your eyes and let the images fade. The forests of Francia, the marble halls of Aachen, the candlelit chapel, the old king on his throne. Let yourself sink into the deep quiet of the night, carrying with you the knowledge that empires rise and fall, that kings are crowned and laid to rest, but that something endures. Memory, legacy, the long conversation between past and present. Sleep well and dream perhaps of a world where swords were laid down and scholars gathered, where churches rose toward heaven and pilgrims walked ancient roads. A fire has gone out now, and the room is dark. But somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of bells ringing across hills, marking the hours, calling the faithful to prayer, just as they did in Charlemagne's time. And in that sound, in that continuity, there is something enduring and good. Good night.